Welcome to ESG in Practice, where we turn environmental, social, and governance topics into practical, actionable steps.
I'm Ann, your guide to data-driven sustainability insights.
And I'm Abby, with 2 decades of hands-on experience in this field.
Together with our guests, we're unraveling the complexities of ESG, where we move the discussion away from glossary reporting
to make sustainability and compliance a real competitive advantage for your business.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to ESG in Practice. We're here with Richard Bistrong. Hello, Richard. Can you introduce yourself to our audience, as you are the first international guest that we have outside of Europe?
Well, thanks, Sam, and thanks, Abby. It's great to be here in Oslo having this discussion together. My name is Richard Bistrong. I'm the CEO of Front Line Anti-Bribery. My story is a little bit of a journey from corruption to compliance. Very briefly, I spent 20 years as a sales executive for a large global multinational. Spent the first half of my career focused on the U.S. market, and this was a publicly listed company. I certainly understood the pressure to succeed and the pressure to comply. And then the second half of my career focused on international sales. Just to date it a little bit, from 1997 to 2007, flying all over the world, traveling 250 days a year overseas, living in the United Kingdom. There's $2 trillion of global corruption being siphoned off our global economic system due to no one's fault but my own, because cheating's always a choice. I engaged in a number of bribery conspiracies with, let's just call it more broadly, third parties, resellers, distributors, agents, and intermediaries. And 10 years later, the investigators caught up with me in the United States and the United Kingdom. I cooperated immediately. I did it. I wasn't going to put up a novel defense theory. Cooperated for 5 years with international law enforcement and with the Department of Justice. Ultimately served 14 and a half months in federal prison for my own bribery offenses. Okay. I got back home from prison in December 2013 and started diving into the ethics and compliance world, where I saw a lot of interesting and well-resourced perspectives. Abby, as you know from your career, from the legal, from a regulatory, from an investigatory perspective, what I didn't see is anyone talking about what is it like to be tasked with commercial success in volatile and high-risk parts of the world. What does that look like? What does that feel like? With no business model in mind, I just started writing these long 3,000-word posts about it, and ultimately that led to me being asked to speak at compliance conferences, and then people in the audience were like, can you come talk to our teams about this? So I got caught in 2007, and it wasn't until 2017 when I was no longer under court supervision. I had my passport returned. I had my civil rights restored. It was a 10-year journey through the criminal justice systems. By 2017, it was, can you come to Shanghai? Can you come to Singapore? Can you come to Dubai? And that's when the practice really formed, which is when we first met.
Yeah, we actually met at Microsoft. You had been a speaker at Microsoft before. In our area of business, we were considering you as a speaker. We ended up going with somebody else, but we also kept in touch. So it's great that we get to actually meet in person this time.
Absolutely.
Really interesting background, Richard. And I think what people like and want you to speak about is the front lines experience that you have as a salesperson that's under pressure. There's a lot of compliance conferences where compliance officers just speak more theoretically or how they see it from the headquarters level. But you bring a unique insight that not many people actually have. I would love to get your thoughts about that and how you've seen it change or stay the same since 2007 when you first got caught.
I think if we're going to start the marker, let's start it at 2014 when I first started diving into ethics and compliance, because back to 2007, I was more, okay, now I have to deal with the consequences of non-compliance. What I have seen over the last 10 years is multinationals have built what we might consider to be world-class ethics and compliance platforms. When I think of a platform, I'm thinking about due diligence. I'm thinking about a robust code of conduct complemented by e-learning, in-person training. Over the last 10 years, the ethics and compliance box has been built. The good news and the not so good news is now it's about getting the business to take ownership of it, and for the business to appreciate that E and C leaders are not there to make decisions or to stop decisions. They are there as a partner to success by helping people make better informed decisions. that's where we struggle in terms of making that connection with business leaders. Like, we're here as your partner, not to block or prevent
not to be
business.
The police. And I've seen that in my own career too. I do think that's the evolution, like you said, of governance and compliance. I always said in my previous companies that we're not the police, we're the guardrails. We allow the business to go faster, but we protect them also along the way. What do you think the biggest challenge is in that divide that you've seen within the companies?
Well, I think that particularly now, we're 2024, we're facing global economic, political, and social turmoil. And there is certainly the need for speed among whether it's your business and commercial leaders or your procurement leaders. Part of it is they're just not focused on this. They've got a lot of decisions to make. They've got to make them quickly. They want to recapture market share in a very S-curve market right now. So I think they're just distracted. If you haven't started this journey before 2024, it's hard to start it now, particularly.
Interesting background and career, Richard. But I am more thinking now from a company perspective. They set up, for example, compliance functions within the company. They have people working and they have specific measures and requirements to report. And I want to go back to your past a little bit. How effective do you think these are? Would you have been able to escape, kind of avoid these measures that are set by the companies?
Look, I got away with it for 10 years. We should think about a few things. Number one, bad behavior can hide behind good performance. Success can block scrutiny. We still see that in our enforcement actions where there were compliance controls, but they were overridden by the business. Sometimes they're overridden because of good performers. Who wants to block a good performer? Part of it, and I know that you're passionate about data, but if you get too far down in the weeds of data, and you just start looking at everybody's behavior transactionally instead of holistically, you can miss a lot of risk. The bribery conspiracies that I was convicted of occurred in low-risk parts of the world, the Netherlands, New York, and the transaction amounts were low. If you were looking at me transactionally, I was not a red flag. If you were looking at me holistically and the pattern of my discounts, my marketing allowances, my commissions and retainers, I was a walking red flag. It's all a matter of you have information, how are you interpreting it?
Exactly.
And that's how I was able to avoid it.
That's a good point, because I think that in the industry, there's two challenges. One is there's not enough data in certain parts of compliance that we see. But the other one is that there is actually a lot of data, but people don't know how to harness it or use it or actually see the patterns with it. That's where I see data science coming in as a new field, but then it's applied in so many different sectors, but it hasn't been really applied thoroughly in compliance. And that's what we've seen in the work that we do. But I'm curious, you have a few interesting articles coming out. Can you tell us about them?
One article that I co-authored, it was in Fast Company, so maybe we can put the link in the show notes, is why high performers are more subject to ethical risk. So that may sound a little bit counterintuitive. You might think if someone's high performing, it means they're doing things the right way. But the research turned up a couple of surprises. And one of them I related to very personally is that once you become the corporate hero, now I was the corporate hero in that the international sales division was making up for deficits in other sales markets. So I was getting all the accolades, all the high fives, so to speak. Once you have that corporate hero status, who wants to lose that? The challenge with high performers is you expect more high performance out of them. Speaking more personally and behaviorally, I was down in the rabbit hole of success, and I had a financial success addiction. Nothing was going to get me out of that rabbit hole. The question is, if someone has a great year, are you complimenting them on how they got the business done and not just getting the business done? And are you celebrating the right kind of success? And maybe giving them a little bit of latitude in acknowledging, look, let's take a look at the market next year. What does it look like to you? Because we know that market growth is an S.
Yeah,
it's not a straight line up.
That's true.
The other piece that we found a little bit counterintuitive is when we're climbing the corporate ladder, we care what people think about us. And that includes ethics and compliance. We want to be known as good corporate citizens, as good people. When we get to the top of that ladder, we don't care quite as much what people think about us, which makes us more prone to taking ethical risk.
You feel like you're untouchable.
Feel like we're untouchable. I'm going to remember that. That's exactly right. Until the regulators touch you.
How did the regulators find you? How did you get caught?
You probably read this story over and over in that my situation was not that unusual and I got swept up in a global investigation. It was the United Nations Oil for Food. There was a particular distributor, a third party, that was being investigated for bribing a United Nations procurement official to win food contracts. I was in the life-saving equipment business, like armored vehicles and armored vests. So what does food have to do with protective products? Nothing, except that through that same reseller and to that same UN procurement official, I was funneling bribes through the third party to gain inside information on what the UN was paying for protective products. The center of the investigation was the third party, and we've seen that time and time again where people think, I'm never going to get in trouble. What they don't think about is what happens if my third party gets into trouble.
That's why there's so much focus on third-party management, how to manage the stakeholders and how to identify risk within your supply chain. Do you have any thoughts on that, just based on your experience?
And also just what kind of data signals would you look for when trying to detect this kind of patterns in relationship with the third parties?
Let's look at an obvious one, travel and entertainment. Very often we're looking at gifts, travel, and entertainment, and we're looking for fraud. Is someone funneling money out through their expense accounts? Yeah. But those T&E reports also tell you who your people are spending time with. Wow. They're a behavioral fingerprint. If you saw, for example, that a particular employee was spending a lot of time, not necessarily a lot of money, but a lot of time with a particular third party, you might want to ask, can you tell us a little bit more about what you talk about? Because it seems like this is an important counterparty for us. We'd like to get to know more. It's not always the size of the entertainment, it's the frequency. So again, a piece of data where I think you can question someone in a non-defensive way. We're not accusing you of anything. We just, given the amount of business we do with this third party, this seems like a lot of interaction. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Super interesting.
Very.
At least in Norway, one of the last largest corruption cases was probably in 2009, ended in 2014. We haven't heard so much about regulators coming in. Do you feel that this is still an issue? Is it being hidden more? Or what are your thoughts about that?
We know that the demand side is still there. That $2 trillion hasn't gone away. And I think that most multinationals, I will segment multinationals, know that they need to have a robust, fit-for-size ethics and compliance program that regardless of the regulatory activity, which we know can go up and down from year to year, in some cases have short tails and some have long.
Yeah.
And I haven't experienced in my client work any company that said the regulators aren't doing anything, we can lay off the anti-bribery stuff. I think that we're so embedded in this issue, but not every company is a multinational.
Exactly.
You could see a mid-size or small-size company or even a mid-size or small-size multinational saying, you know what, there's no regulatory issues going out there. There's no enforcement. Why should we invest a ton of money into this?
And what would your answer be to a mid-sized company that says this?
I would say it's not worth it to roll the dice. Number one, I think every company has values, has a mission, and has a purpose. I would say to a small-sized company or a mid-sized company, do you have values or you're like a valueless company? You have no mission, you have no purpose. Of course, they're going to say, no, our values are customer first. I'd say, okay, you should think about what are the structures that you have to support those values to drive the outcomes and the decisions that you want. As a small company, it might not be large structures, but you need to have some structures in there. And I see this a lot in my biotech client work, where you might have a company that doesn't even have a product yet, and they're still in clinical trial, but I still see, okay, we have an ethics and compliance department that's there to make sure that if we do get approved, that we're fit for size.
That's true. They need it right away once they're approved. That's a really good example. Like you said, the large multinationals, they have teams, they afford to put people in place, but even the smaller, medium-sized stock-listed companies don't. In the market, we see it's quite expensive to hire Big Four consultants that are doing a lot of the implementation. If a company doesn't have the resources, they can't hire a full-time sustainability or compliance officer. Where should they begin on their journey around ethics and compliance?
One of the things that small and mid-sized companies can do is to take advantage of their supply chain. For example, they might be a counterparty to a multinational. They might make a commodity item, but they're selling it to a company that does have a robust ethics and compliance program. For the counterparty that might be publicly listed, they want their suppliers to be doing the right thing. So a good place to turn is to one of your suppliers or one of your customers and say, can you help us? We want to do the right thing. We just don't know where to start. You're one of our partners. And I know from a number of different clients, they are like, we are more than happy to help you because if you get into trouble, that disrupts our supply chain.
That's a good point. And they could also talk about how they engage with their supply chain too. So you're giving them an opportunity to also talk about the work that they do and how they help.
Over the course of the last decade, what are some of the emerging risks or shifts in the industry that you have seen?
There's a report out. It's a company I do some work with, and they have something called a Program Effectiveness Index. They've been doing this for 10 years. And what the data shows is companies are now relying more on a values-based approach to ethics and compliance than a policies, rules, and procedure approach. The biggest shift is the shift to values. And also more companies, I'm not saying all companies, and there's a lot of room to grow here, but companies are trying to better embed ethics and compliance into business decisions. The struggle is in these surveys, top leadership thinks the company's doing a great job at all of this. We have great ethics. We have great compliance. We embed tough decisions into business decisions. And then when you take that same survey data in the middle of the organization, there's a leadership divide.
That's true. Can you talk a little bit more about this values base? Because it's really interesting, that shift that you see. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw before and deep dive a little bit more about the values based?
Sure. And Abby, to your experience, when a lot of these compliance programs started, it was with a criminal law lens. We have U.S. sentencing guidelines.
Department of Justice.
Right? Here's what the SEC says. Here's what the DOJ says. This is what we need to do. If there's a problem, we have to have the binders that we need in our DOJ presentation to show that we've met this. That's a natural start. But now there's a tsunami of regulation. We've got all the European directives. We've got anti-bribery laws that are not homogenized. If you're in life sciences, you have all these transparency acts. Can you expect someone in procurement or in sales to memorize all these laws? It's impossible. You'd have to have a rule for every interaction.
Exactly.
When companies say, think about this. And if there's not a rule for something, think about our values, think about our communities, think about all stakeholders. In my former commercial and my current compliance self, that's what can move people, not necessarily to make the right decision because they still may need help, but it can inspire them to pick up the phone and call and saying, I know what the spirit of what we do, but there's not a rule for this, and this is an ambiguous situation. Like I need to call for support.
I like that values because you're putting a little bit more on the person rather than I need to do this because of a compliance check. I need to do this because it doesn't match with my values or the company values. I think that's a great insight.
I was just wondering, because there's been a big increase on the requirement to report on compliance. If you look at the European regulations, you have to report a lot more now than in the past. Do you think this has had an impact on this shift in behavior that is more value-based?
Well, I don't know in terms of the reporting requirements specifically, because I think these are relatively fresh, right, in terms of dating us to 2024. But it could go both ways, having a massive amount of regulatory reporting. And there's a wonderful book called Higher Ground, How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World by Allison Taylor. The danger is, and she points to this in her book, is that if we go to too much reporting, we can end up with a check-the-box program without even realizing it. And we move away from those values. Instead of, these are the things that we can impact, and this is where we can have a piece and a part of being a responsible corporate citizen, we're now shifting our focus to, no, this is what the regulators expect. This is what we're going to focus on.
I totally agree with that. And we see that in the trend around the sustainability reporting, which often has a governance component within the ESG reporting, is that companies spend so much time on this once a year report, putting so much effort just to report on it and then dropping it for 1 year and then reporting it again. So you lose the continuous monitoring or oversight of it, and it just becomes a tick the box because you can't even track any of these metrics. And so I hope, and I'm wondering about what your thoughts on that, the movement of reporting to report to actually continuous monitoring and controls, where reporting is the byproduct. So reporting should be talking about what you do, not what you're just reporting to report. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think the key words there are continuous monitoring, because ethics and compliance is like a cycle uphill.
Yeah.
We stop pedaling, we're going in the wrong direction. And I think that risk changes. I mean, there are stubborn risks, but there are new and emerging risks. So that continuous monitoring, and I think you're right, reporting is a byproduct. That's really well said. I remember when COVID first started back, 2020? All of a sudden, there was bribery risk for being declared an essential business in a country. So in certain countries, whether or not your corporation made it or not was being declared as an essential business by the government, in which case you could stay open. And there was bribery risk. Now, in 2019, if you said, where is being declared an essential business in your code of conduct? But who knew that? The people that were facing that risk. So do you have like a proactive feedback loop where you're always asking, what aren't we seeing? The only things we can't help you with are the ones that you're keeping to yourself. We always want that feedback with you.
We talked about this in our previous podcast with Anna Romberg, was that the importance of really getting close to the business. And I've had this experience sitting in the headquarters where you're directing, but not really truly understanding how the business works and how they actually do sales. You think you know from the headquarters, but until you actually sit down and have coffee with them. And in one of my companies, I had, I think, 30 to 60 coffees in 3 months, just sitting down. And that was 2 to 3 years after I started the organization, and how much I learned in that period of actually how things work on the ground. But I think that's not done enough in our sector because the lack of resourcing or the lack of understanding, compliance officers are often on fire. They're reacting to everything and they don't take the time to sit down and talk with the business. But what are your thoughts on that? In your previous roles, did you talk to compliance officers? How did you see them?
No, it was called dangerous silence, which is a term coined by Amy Edmondson in the Fearless organization. I wasn't calling anyone for help and no one was calling me. Now, again, this is a story of personal accountability and responsibility, but I had no international sales experience when I took this job. I'm successful year one in a world filled with risk. Now, I wasn't calling anyone on how to figure it out. I was figuring it out in the middle of it. But is no news good news? Or should someone have been calling me saying, Richard, you're in this very, very difficult world commercially. We're not hearing from you, and we should be hearing from you. So, Abby, no one was having those 60 cups of coffee with me, like talking to me, because I think early on in this new international sales career, that would have made the difference. I'm like, you know what? I've made some bad decisions and I've covered them up, but I've gotten to know Abby well enough to know if I tell her what's gone on, I don't think she's going to promote me, but she's probably going to say, okay, let's figure this out because you're going to have the same risk again. Let's try to make it an intelligent failure and one that we can all learn from. But that speaks to, it's a different angle on what you said, hanging around the espresso machine and getting to know people and not sitting in a windowless office issuing policies, rules, and procedures.
When I have talked with compliance officers, they're like, oh my gosh, I don't have enough time, or they think it's crazy. When I moved to my last chief compliance officer role, I met with all the country managers, over 45 country managers in that short period of starting. And that was a great onboarding because you start to see the politics and understand how the organization works. And people thought I was crazy. They're like, really, you're doing this? That would be really an advice to people working in compliance. Don't be scared. Talk to people because you actually learn a lot more about what's happening on the ground.
That's so well said, Abby. To our listeners today, it doesn't have to be formal. Maybe there's a sales meeting. Maybe there's a business leadership meeting, and you're not invited to give a formal presentation, but you're not uninvited either. Like, show up, hang out, and get to know people.
Exactly. And I would say don't be scared, because when I did it the first time, people would actually not show up because they're so scared of compliance. I had a few that kept avoiding the meeting with me. It's like, why does she want a coffee chat with me? But the majority were actually okay with it. Sometimes people get scared if you have a bad reaction. It's okay. Keep going. And people are friendly and want to chat and love to talk about what they do.
No one wants to have the first coffee with Abby because everyone's wondering, why is she having this coffee? The second coffee and the third coffee, they're like, wow, she's very cool. I know that if I have a problem, she's not going to judge me and send me to my code of conduct. She's going to want to work it out.
I think that was really eye-opening, that I learned about a lot of risks that I didn't realize because I didn't know how business was actually run in the sales organizations or with third parties. So definitely a good tip.
Richard, I hear that you have another high-profile article coming up. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Well, Em, I can give you a sneak preview now, and by the time we go live, hopefully it will have been published, but it's on ethical burnout and how people, even with the best intentions, can get overwhelmed by their targets, their goals, all the different decisions we're throwing at them. And they might say, I just don't have time for thinking about what to do in the right way. What I'm thinking about is just how to get these goals done because there's just so many of them. And the research, it's called economic strain theory. It's worth looking up. When people feel those economic pressures, it can point them in the wrong direction. Me and my co-authors were expanding on that, and we have found 4 different signals that you can detect before it's too late where people might be heading toward ethical burnout and steps that you can do to prevent it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And could you give a couple examples?
The first one is to look out for commercial pressures with decreasing options to meet them. You're giving people tougher goals with less resources to make them. When companies are cutting back on resources, but they're not cutting back on goals, rewards, and objectives.
I've seen that in organizations. It's quite common, right?
Yeah. That could be a toxic combination. That's one sneak preview.
Very cool one.
You have such interesting research and articles. How do you get involved in that?
I have a mentor. Her name is Dory Clark. She wrote a book called Reinventing You that I read in prison. And it's a book that really changed the course of my life, to say the least. The work that we've done together, one-on-one work, and she has a mastermind, which is like a cohort retreat. Part of that and part of the goal that I had in working with Dory was to write for high-profile publications like Fast Company and the Harvard Business Review. Yeah. And it was really a challenge and a good one because it's really taking issues that you might think, oh, this is an ethics and compliance issue, and how can you make it relevant for all readers? It's been a fun journey doing it.
If you were to say to a salesperson right now who's maybe feeling under a little bit of pressure, he has either close to doing something wrong or has done something wrong in the past, what would you say to that person, or what kind of advice would you give that person?
I'm going to sequence you if you're listening. The first thing to do is to call home. This is a very personal part of my journey, but to listen to the voices of your friends and family and loved ones, the people that are counting on you to do the right thing. Just have a conversation with them, because we're talking about structures and controls and values. I think we underestimate how much our network of families, friends, and loved ones can help keep our ethical compass where it belongs. So listen to those voices and remind yourself, if you make the wrong decision, I'm not saying you're going to go to prison, but you could lose your job. It could have financial consequences on your family. Check yourself in with your family and then call your compliance leader, and then you unpack the problem as a team. The decisions that you want to happen are the decisions that are actually happening. And I think this is another challenge, Em, to your point, is we've seen a shift where people are doing the wrong things because they think they're helping the company. Now, that's much different than 15 years ago.
Interesting.
Where people were doing the wrong decisions for the wrong reasons, for themselves. Now it's more like, oh, I'm taking this shortcut, I'm circumventing this process because I'm getting things done faster. I'm not profiting off of it, but the company is doing well. It's never worth it. Taking a shortcut you might think is worth it for you, but you're putting a lot of people at risk. So just understand that if you make the wrong decision and it gets discovered, you'll be standing alone. You always have an opportunity to surface challenges, even surface bad decisions, and unpack them with your team. Challenges and ethical dilemmas age like milk. They do not age like wine. The sooner you surface them, the easier it is to fix.
Really great advice. Thank you for sharing that.
All right, cool. Very interesting discussion so far, but I think it's time for the rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I think so.
Great. One word to describe the future of ethics and compliance.
Integration.
The biggest misconception about ethics and compliance.
It's there to slow you down.
And your go-to metric for ethics and compliance success.
Are ethics and compliance expectations being shared and set by the business, not just ethics and compliance teams?
It's a great one. Biggest challenge in ethics and compliance implementation.
Business distraction and the need for speed.
And the most underrated aspect of ethics and compliance.
How it can be a partner to sustainable commercial success.
How would you define ethics and compliance?
To help people have a balanced mindset between risk and innovation, and to help them make better and better informed decisions.
Why is ethics and compliance implementation more important than the reporting?
Well, for the people in the field, reporting doesn't impact their decision-making. Implementation does, but I like words that start with the same letter. So maybe we can also shift the frame here to not only implementation, but to inspiring people and influencing them.
There's so much more I want to talk with you, but we're going to have to find another time.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for your time. This is really interesting.
It was nice to have a different perspective from someone from your background and from a different part of the world. So I'm very happy that I got to meet you in person.
Same here, Em. It's been a pleasure. Abby, finally nice to meet in person.
Thank you to all our listeners for your support so far. If you like this episode, we will highly appreciate you rating it 5 stars to help increase the reach of ESG in practice.
And if you want to be notified when our next episode drops, please hit the follow button.